In the inky black of space, there is only war and robots, weird aliens, hives of villainy, starships, lasers, and stuff. There is a lot in the inky black of space, and today we are going to talk about 5 parsecs from home. 5 parsecs from home is a solo miniature wargame, and as such, about as far removed from the sort of game my tactical reviews are suited to as it is possible to be. It is very random. There are the usual miniature ambiguities with measurement and line of sight, and the game actively encourages you to house rule as you go. In the broad philosophical debate about what exactly a miniature game is, a craft project or a competitive game, I come down fairly heavily on the side of craft project. I generally don't recommend miniature wargaming to anyone unless they want to assemble miniatures. As such, I view 5 parsecs from home as a niche within a niche, but an interesting one. Here is something you can frame a miniatures project around. And that is what I did, using the game as an opportunity to assemble things in my bits box and build scenery. It's worth saying that this is a big difference between 5 parsecs and its ragtag Firefly setting and the bug hunt version with its aliens-based scenarios. You can treat either game either way, but they are differently suited, and the latter is much more of a tactical challenge solitaire type game. I'm going to be talking about 5 parsecs primarily, but I wanted to note that Bug Hunt exists and suits itself better to being a solitaire challenge with pre-existing miniatures. I know someone who is developing an aliens-based campaign for it. In 5 parsecs, you control a small crew. You can opt for a unit size of 4, 5, or 6, and I went for 4. Undertaking missions on the edge of civilized space. The first thing you need to do is draw up a crew roster and make some basic decisions about the campaign, such as the aforementioned unit size and the objectives. I'll talk about those in a moment. There are various ways to work out your initial crew, but by far the most fun is to randomly roll for them. I ended up with a misfit group of criminals led by Blake, and this was the first trip to the bits box. I had randomly rolled profiles, so now I needed to find figures to match them. 2 old Necromunda miniatures, a drone from Dead Zone, and Blake got kit bashed from some sci-fi and World War II parts. I made their modelled weapons match the loadouts I chose for them. I have a real bee in my bonnet about the misuse of the term role-playing game, RPG. This is absolutely not an RPG, but it is, regardless of how you play it, a narrative experience. The game really encourages you to develop house rules, to think about your characters as characters, and as what they're doing as part of a story. One of my very first house rules reflected the way I was thinking about this. Rules as written, all of your crew's weapons and equipment are held in common and can be assigned as you think best at the start of each mission. I didn't like that. It didn't suit my craft project approach or my mental image of this as an episodic TV show with recognizable characters and their favorite weapons. So I decided characters would have fixed loadouts and that the model would reflect that. If I needed a new loadout, I would make a new model. I don't entirely need a set of character sheets, but I designed a set. I actually set up my campaign by just jotting stuff down on random bits of paper tucked into the back of the rulebook while I was traveling, but I designed proper sheets before my first game that allowed me to track the crew and record missions. Let's talk about the campaign turn. The game is played as an indefinite series of campaign turns, and those always work the same way. First of all, you find out whether or not your characters are traveling to a new world. Then you assign tasks for your crew. Then you choose a mission, dice up a battle, and fight the battle on the tabletop, and then you resolve a series of post-battle steps. Each campaign turn involves one battle. So let's take a look at the battle. Procedural table for the first campaign turn tells us we have 5 enemy gunslingers, one of whom is a leader and one of whom has a sniper rifle, and the objective is to fight them off. This is a patron mission rolled up during character generation. Who is Caspian? What is Blake doing on Ramesses? Why would he have contacts with the Ares security services? And why would that contact call him Senator? Who knows? It's fairly clear Dagger and Rock don't, and D5 doesn't talk very much. The models for the very first engagement are the Iron Guard, ancient warriors cybernetically sustained long past the war they originally served in. I have some old figures which on the continuum of toy soldiers are more toy than miniature, if that makes any sense. But this is about painting stuff in bits boxes, so I got the whole group out and I prepped them up and I did some experimenting with rust effects while I was doing it. I transferred the stats for those troops to a quick reference sheet and I created some spare space for adding more details later. There are sample sheets for doing this at the back of the 5 Parsecs book that you can photocopy. The idea of photocopying character sheets from the back of a book just seems really old-fashioned. To actually get to the first game, I also needed some terrain, and I also needed some storage for the figures, and the two of those were going to be solved together. My storage boxes are 4.5-inch cubes, which can hold up to 18 figures. As you can see, the figures go inside, but I can also use the cube itself as terrain. And the first clash of the first battle was a melee with Dagger. The rules are a bit ambiguous. I think the intention is to give a +1 if you have a pistol and a +2 if you have a melee weapon. I don't really like that, and I house ruled it later to be that if you're only carrying a pistol and a melee weapon, you get both. Either way, that overcomes the Iron Guard's advantage of +1 from a combat skill, regardless of how you interpret it. After you compare rolls in close combat, you roll to wound. In this case, it was fairly dull. It just resulted in a stun to the Iron Guard. But there was a subsequent round of combat, and that resulted in 3 hits. 1 for Dagger winning, 1 for the Iron Guard rolling a 1, 1 for Dagger rolling a 6, which guarantees taking the guard out. Wound rolls are done by rolling a die and adding the weapon's damage value and comparing it to the target's toughness. If you score equal or greater, the opponent is incapacitated. If not, they are stunned. But if a figure accumulates 3 stuns, then they're incapacitated anyway. And obviously, 3 hits has to result in 3 stuns. The round is split into 3 parts. Your characters with initiative act, then all the enemy act, then your remaining characters act. On the Iron Guard's turn, a 6 to hit followed by another 6 scores a hit on Rock from the Iron Guard sniper. I use a stim pack to cancel this. The game is inherently swingy because it rests on a relatively small number of dice rolls. For comparison, D7 and the enemy captain spent the whole game in a long-range duel that didn't result in the incapacitation of either of them. The tide turns in my favour fairly quickly. The game is asymmetric, and as a player, you get access to some rules that the AI opponent does not have, one of which is Panic Fire. Panic Fire allows you to add 2 extra shots to an attack, but the weapon is then out of ammunition. Blake uses the rule to drop the sniper when he rounds the corner, and as the team converge, Rock does the same thing to drop the target D7 has been missing for the whole time. Blake's crew have proven their mettle and made a small contribution to restoring order in the Ares sector. But this is only the first episode. Okay, narrative aside, let's be clear, 5 Parsecs is a pretty random game. I was lucky rather than skilled, which is not to say that there are no tactics at all. Let's go back to that lucky hit on Rock. As the player, you have access to a variety of finite options you can spend. For example, Rock had a stim pack that I used, a one-use item that stops an incapacitating wound and reduces it to a simple stun. Technically, rules as written, that is an option available to the whole crew, but I insist on allocating these things to a specific character. That is what kept him in this fight and got me through the first engagement with no casualties. But I did have another option, which are story points. I have 4 of these, and they would allow me a reroll. The guard needed a 5 to hit. You normally need a 6 if an opponent is in cover, but the Iron Guard have a +1 combat skill, and a 4 to wound, which is just because Rock is relatively tough. Which raises the question, if I had used a story point, should I have done so on the 2 hit roll before I knew the result of the damage roll, or waited to see that result, at which point I could only spend it to re-roll the damage roll? Which is more likely to succeed? The first thing to recognize is that you're making a strategic choice that keeping Rock in the game rather than risking his incapacitation is important. You've effectively already decided, or should have decided before rolling to wound, that you're willing to spend the reroll. So this is purely about the odds of a wound depending on when you spend that roll. If your intuition was that you spend it on the roll that is less likely to succeed, the 2 hit roll, you were spot on. You are reducing the chance by about a third. Of course, it gets slightly more complicated if you are thinking long run rather than game critical, because you only have to spend the story point on the wound roll half the time, because half the time when they hit, they fail to wound. Okay, let's imagine you repeat this scenario 8 times and you have 4 story points. If you re-roll successful hits, you will run out of re-rolls after 4 shots, resulting in a little less than 3 casualties on average, because you have to face 4 shots without re-rolls, and those have a 1 in 2 chance of wounding. On the other hand, if you only re-roll after receiving a wound, you would expect to spend 4 rerolls over 8 events. As your chances now are 1 in 4, that means on average you expect just 2 casualties. Is this always true that re-rolling the lower chance of a hit is better for a mission critical shot and re-rolling the wound is always more efficient? Well, let's think about this with a more common set of numbers. Most characters are not as tough as Rock, so would be wounded on a 3+. A lot of enemies aren't as accurate as the Iron Guard, so would only hit on a 6+ in this situation. Obviously, mission critical, you are still much better off re-rolling the hit roll. But now let's repeat the scenario 6 times. Why 6? Well, there is a 2 in 3 chance of a wound, so we expect to burn 4 re-rolls typically over 6 events if we are re-rolling the wounds. And obviously, since the chance of a wound in that case is 4 in 9, we now expect a little less than 3 casualties that way. If we reroll the first 4 hits, the chances of those getting through are just 1 in 9, but we do then need to take 2 straight 2 in 3 hits. But that is still a little shy of 2 casualties typically. In this scenario, rerolling the hits is more efficient as well as better from a mission critical point of view. If you're trying to get your head around what is going on here, it's that when you are dealing with chains of dice rolls, like the hit wound save mechanic common in sci-fi war games, rerolls become more efficient when used later in the chain because they are not being wasted against hits that do not come to fruition, but rerolls are more impactful when the chances of the event were less likely to begin with, and those two can be in tension with each other. All of which analysis does mean my use of the stim pack was the best thing to do. Because the stim pack is used after all the rolls are made and it always succeeds, it's always more efficient and effective than a reroll. But I wanted to highlight that the game is not entirely without tactical and strategic choices. But it's a solitaire narrative focused miniature game, so it's not the place you come if those kinds of choices are what you're after. Quick note on the combat system in the game, which occupies a fairly small part of the whole rule set because this is really about the campaign, not the individual battle. The rules are fairly derivative. If you played any of the many games loosely derived from Warhammer 40k, you will recognise most of the elements here. True, that's not necessarily a negative thing. It does mean that the game's easy to get to grips with. There is, as I already noted, quite a lot of randomness. There is also some ambiguity in the system used to control the bad guys. That's going to be frustrating if you want this to be a tactical puzzle or really are committed to following rules as written, but you don't have an opponent to argue with, so it's not that bad. Overall, they're relatively well written and a solid set of rules. Simple and easy to follow. I forgot a few things, but not much in my first game. Okay, having discussed the battle, let's go back to the framing campaign turn. You do a bunch of procedural stuff after the game, which involves essentially getting paid and gathering loot from the battle and establishing the extent of any injuries. Once you have done that, you start another turn. We'll talk a little bit about the strategic aspect of this. Blake is up to something, vaguely plotting with sinister central world elites. But what it is he's doing, we don't know. In game mechanic terms, it means I have chosen my objective for the campaign to be the completion of 3 quests. Those require me to complete quest missions, but to get a quest mission, you need to acquire rumours. Technically, I only need to acquire 3, but I think the campaign would take a long time if I only got 3 rumours. So I want to get more than that. We can get rumours by sending characters to trade or explore during the pre-battle phase. There's also a variety of ways they can arise in the procedurally generated missions. And finally, it is possible to acquire them through the post-mission events. Of these, you only really have any control over sending crew to trade or explore, and that means crew size matters. I picked a crew size of 4, so I can only put 4 figures on the table for a battle, but I can have a larger crew than that and use them in the pre-battle phase. One of the tasks that they can undertake is to recruit more crew, so you have a strategic trade-off here of how much time and effort you put into increasing the crew size before you start allocating the crew to the tasks you actually want to achieve. So there is a strategic element to my campaign in that Blake, for whatever reason, is seeking to recruit in the frontier worlds. I do have one further option to increase the crew size, which I dice up after the first session. The game suggests 5 stars of the story options, which you can spend once each campaign. Again, this spending of finite resources is part of the game's strategic dynamic. One of those gives an extra character and has that character turn up in the middle of a battle, breaking the normal limit on the number of characters. So I want that character prepped in advance because it feels like that is an option I want to be able to pull out in some suitable mid-season crisis that requires a mysterious old friend of Blake to rescue the crew. I'm also going to use this to explain an optimal loadout for a character. Characters can carry 2 weapons plus a pistol or a blade. A blade gives a +2 for melee, so is generally preferable. But the character should usually also be carrying 2 ranged weapons of slightly different types. The reason for this is that you can then panic fire one of the weapons for 2 extra shots early in the battle, thinning the enemy lines, and still then use the second weapon. That doesn't feel narratively terribly satisfying, but given that Ranger is an inherently cheesy, silly character based on an inherently cheesy, silly TV trope, we're going to use it here. So that's at least one more model I need to prep before the next campaign turn. And I have more to do than that. Dagger managed to acquire a cute repair droid, but somehow lost their chainsword. That means a new model for Dagger, and the crew got hired by Cartouche Industries to deal with a critter infestation, which means a new set of bad guys. I don't technically need to make a model for the repair droid, but I'm going to. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with a blow-by-blow of my whole campaign, though I might work it into my ongoing annual miniature review. So let's get on towards the conclusion. As I noted, the game actively encourages you to house rule. It does, and I would agree, suggest you start by playing rules as is and always apply house rules with care. It's harder to design good rules than most people think. Finally, let me just re-summarize what you need. Remember, this is a miniatures wargame of a traditional type, however of the moment solitaire miniature wargames might be. All you actually get for your money is the rulebook. You need some dice, some counters. You'll have to make your own counters, and tape measures. You'll also need about half a dozen miniatures to start, depending on exactly your initial setup. You'll need at least a 2-foot square battlefield and some terrain. You'll also need to enjoy your own company. But overall, this is a relatively low investment, low model count miniature wargame. If you're interested in listening to someone talk about their campaign, the one I found most entertaining was Me, Myself and Die. Though 5 Parsecs is not a role-playing game, that is the angle that this content creator is coming from, so it's quite interesting. As I've suggested, this is not going to appeal if you're looking for a solitaire tactical problem. This isn't a game like D-Day at Omaha Beach. You have to have some interest in the narrative element, though your investment will vary, and some interest in the miniature craft projects, though again, your investment will vary. But you need at least some interest in both of those. Hopefully, I've given you enough to know if 5 Parsecs might be of interest to you, or if you would want to avoid it like the plague. I suspect this is a bit of a Marmite game. For now, here endeth the lesson.